Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, I've been speaking with Nduka and Peter Midgley. Nduka is Associate Professor and Graduate Program Coordinator at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario. He's also author and co-editor of 8 books on creative writing and academic research. But we'll be talking with him about his latest collection of poetry, his third, called DisPlace, which was published in October 2021 by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Peter Midgley is an independent scholar, writer, and editor who worked with Nduka on DisPlace. This 4-part series is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Nduka's poetry deals with the politics of language, ideas of place, the diaspora, and the colonization of knowledge. His poetry is conversational, spiritual, and performative. If you closely consider the title, DisPlace, you'll notice the pidgin pronunciation of this place, but also displace, and the simultaneous feelings of belonging and detachment, where you are now and where you once were. It's a direct reference to Nduka's Nigerian background and points to a characteristic of his poetry that is, as Nduka calls it, beyond world literature. In this final episode of the series, we're very excited to feature readings and discussion of 2 of Nduka's poems. And Peter and Nduka dive further into what they mean when simply deciding what language to write in can be a radically political act. Nduka, I know you've selected a couple of poems you'd like to read, and that would be fantastic if you could. Do you want to start with today, Time is the Eyeglass I Wear?
Okay, so I'd like to read the very first poem in this book, which I found, and I still find very intriguing, as a matter of fact. I still find it quite intriguing reading it back after writing it. And it's entitled, Today, Time is the Eyeglass I Wear. Today, time is the eyeglass I wear. The purple rim masks the scars of the years, and the lenses periscope the joys in my soul. Look, you will find the window to hidden treasures, every peep a kaleidoscope of experience, and an invitation to share secrets of the Most High. Come, and you will find me at the altar of time, incense on my left, Ikenga on my right. Come with your own totems, worship with me. It's a 3-stanza poem, and that's it.
What is Nkenga?
I would ask Peter to help me describe what Ikenga is, because we had a very fascinating conversation around Ikenga. It looks like a simple word, but we did quite a bit of conversations and research. You know, one of those items that you're so familiar with growing up that is part of your culture. And then at a more conscious level, you are required to speak about it, and you're suddenly lost for words. You know what it is, but how do you say what Ikenga is? And in order to get it right, to be sure that we had all of those appropriate ways of looking at it, I had used the word totem. So it's some kind of totem. It's religious and all of that. Peter, do you want to help me out?
Totem is probably a good word, but there's the idea is a carved ritual figure that symbolizes personal power and strength, often seen with a raised right hand and bearing a spear, and it is. So it's an embodiment of the ancestral spirits that accompany us and guide us through life, and in fact through this entire collection.
Okay.
Yeah, and then it comes as a figurine.
Yeah,
that's very important. It's a carved figurine. It's a sculptural piece that has spiritual powers. Is loaded with a lot of potency. And if you just Google the Ikenga, you're going to see the images pop up. It would appear as if it has 2 horns and all of that. But, this is something that is very dominant in Igbo cosmology, as some other aspects of our culture, that are embedded in the word Ikenga. And in some within the kind of rites of ritual, it also has this very strong ritualistic association. You could find that in shrines where titled men, would pour libations and all of those kind of references or items of religious worship, in deference to it.
So it's positioned in as the first poem, but how would you describe the significance of that in this collection?
It's an invocation of our ancestral spirits, as it were, because it's something that is also considered as like an alosi, which is like some kind of god, and then it's also associated with the chi, the personal god, and so putting it there, it's I think it's a process like a prayer, saying, oh, we're embarking on this journey. Look, this is where we are. We are supplicant, as Okibo would say, Mother Idoto, before you, naked I stand. So it's a spiritual activation through prayer and sacrifice. So it's an invocation at the beginning of a journey. One that is saying, accompany me, your pain, respect, acknowledging the God, our ancestral spirits. Here we are embarking on this poetic journey. Come be with us. And the resonance is also very clear with regards to the Christian allusion that is there. As I said, these are part of the allusive style, that I have adopted in my poetry. Yes.
To put it in a frame that may be more familiar in a Western frame of mind is, it's not unlike the way that Dante would invoke Virgil as his companion in the Divine Comedy.
Mm-hmm.
So that we're constantly aware of the shadow of Virgil leading us through through the Divine Comedy, just as here we need to be aware constantly in every poem of the Ikenga helping us, guiding us, leading us through the poems and through the entire journey of this book.
Wonderful.
And then it's also important to note that we have in that line, it's a incense. So you have a juxtaposition of incense and the Ikenga. Incense is naturally associated with the Catholic Mass, and Ikenga is African traditional from the Igbo culture. So this is that syncretism, that Peter highlighted, and I'm proudly the product of this syncretism, without in any case privileging one over the other, because that is often the terrain that it almost inevitably heads into, where you have in some parts of the continent where people who convert to Christianity begin to burn, quote and unquote, idol totems of idol worship. Whereas that's not the case. This is a worldview. This is a way that our people live. There is a communication. There is a belief between the living and the dead. And this is also something to invoke a Canadian parallel that we see with Indigenous peoples of Canada, with their worldview.
Yeah. It's that sense of those who came before us, who live among us and inform us and our lives to this day still. So when I say use terms like ancestors, it doesn't mean, as in a Western sense, those who are deceased, and goes, yes, it does mean that, but it also means a spiritual embodiment of influences that accompany us now in our lives. They are part of our world. It's a different view of, it's just a different world view that doesn't see a distinction between these realms the way we might in a Western frame. And so for me, it is, in the introduction, is trying to lead readers to explore those different kinds of worldviews, to come to the book not from a Western perception of what literature is, but to come to it to accept that worldview, not to question it in any way, but to accept it, to imbibe it, and to move from there out, because that is when the richness of this poetry comes out.
Yes. And then also invoking the communal spirit. So it's both the
Yeah.
personal and the communal spirit.
Hmm. Nduka, I know you have a second one you'd like to read.
Yes. So I'll read another poem from the new poems. This was also written in the context of the COVID, and is entitled "A Chain of Requiems." I actually got this title from a chat. I can't remember exactly, where somebody was lamenting about the death, that was taking place under COVID,
Hmm.
with millions of people dying worldwide. And I reframed it, and I thought this was quite very inspiring. So the title is "A Chain of Requiems," and it's dedicated this way: for the multitudes who perished in the time of coronavirus. In this season of the contagion, life is an antiseptic street of hand sanitizers, bereft of handshakes, kisses, or hugs. In this sterile season of the contagion, life is a chain of requiems. They have vanished without farewells, buried hurriedly amidst silent funerals. Kings and subjects in emergency graves, no bellman to toll for these braves who fought, lonely in their corona suffering. Coronavirus corrodes the world with untimely disappearances, dispensing grief like a sadist in a coven without a brief. As time absconds, life tumbles down an hourglass of mourning.
Hmm.
And that's the end of the poem.
Time is kind of a recurring theme. It seems like here it's kind of absconding. It's sneaking away.
It is such an elusive concept, and here again, I come back to the perceptions of time. We have a very linear perception of time in the West, whereas um, time is not time is not linear. Time doesn't unfold or and doesn't fold into our life in the same way in different frameworks. So we talk about we when we talk about time, we want to think of it in that very linear progression, and that there's a clearly defined past. That past is present.
Right.
It is there's it's just a far more fluid, a non-linear concept in these poems.
Yeah, it's very important to point that out because there's a theory of reading that the reader response theory that I really liked, with deconstruction as a theoretical construct of a Western intellectual tradition, where you'll see that something like time is often seen, you think in terms of the clock. Tick tick says the clock.
Hmm. Hmm.
But there are other cultures where time is kept by nature.
Mm-hmm.
So the day is seen in terms of sunrise and sunset. So there is a certain kind of cyclical nature of death, and that's also embedded in the idea of reincarnation, in the idea of the abiku, a spirit child that goes and comes, which is part of some aspects of our tradition, the abiku, Abiku. And so we do not see things. And so when you say African time, for example, it has a very negative connotation from a Western point of view. But if we look at it from the point of view of climate activism, of the taunting nature, we'll also begin to see that the ways in which people were able to interpret lives and experiences based on their integration into nature. They are one with nature.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, says it ends with an hourglass. So an hourglass, is something that goes down, right?
Hmm.
You find something at the end. Who refills the hourglass? It means that time is just end. But within this culture of dying, and there's so many other poems that deal with this idea of death, of time. There's a preoccupation with time, yes. because I am conscious of it in the sense of how it impacts us as humans. You look at, if you go to the desert, for example, there's nothing more amazing than landforms of, in the deserts where you have an incel bag, or you have forms that are created by wind, just chiseling, say a rock. And that time in that kind of essence, is not just time as an end in itself, but time as a recreative process, as a regenerative process, where the living and the dead are continuously, communicating or commingling. So in the season of the contagion, there's an ironic twist to this. There's also a certain kind of interrogation of this idea and a loading of the idea of how something as basic as handshake and a hug becomes dangerous.
Mm.
How a hug could lead to death. If you think about all of the theories about coronavirus, and one of the initial things, and that I found, troubling at the beginning was, you mean I can hug? And I think many of us still disappoint ourselves. I am not sure. There's no guarantee if I saw Peter today, I'm not likely to hug him. As dangerous as it is. So we are dealing with situations where we are battling with, in my own context, with our natural inclination and what science, imposes for our sustenance and for our safety.
Mm.
They have vanished without farewells. They are not supposed to vanish without farewells,
Mm-hmm.
buried hurriedly amid silent funerals. This was the case even more in some parts where you had mass graves. It's something that is so tragic, that it's in some places it's even worse than wars, where you had entire people, no time to prepare and all of that. You had these mass graves. I do not want to mention specific countries where this happened,
Mm.
where you saw people in the morning and in the evening, they were gone.
Yeah.
And so no bellman to toll for these braves who fought lonely. I am so much bothered about this. And then rethinking the whole idea of time as an end,
Mhm.
because from a certain Christian perspective, we think about the last judgment, so there's a lot that's going on here, but the most basic thing there is the idea of how life becomes a chain of requiems. And I think many people in the world today are still. Colin Powell just died. He would not have died perhaps at 84 if it weren't for COVID. Then we can make all of the arguments we want about old people, but we do know that they were also very vulnerable. People who were in their 90s, who could have possibly lived into their hundreds, died, became victims, became casualties rather of this very dreaded contagion.
I have one more question for each of you, and you've both mentioned and talked about the politics of language, and I'd like each of you to talk a little bit more about that. And how do politics enter into language, particularly in African oral and more specifically Nigerian literature? Nduka, how are you navigating that use of your colonial language, which has its own purposes beyond what many might assume, and your indigenous language, Igbo, which again is a more complex decision than others might understand?
Thank you. I think this is a very important question, especially given the context, from which we operate.
Mm.
Language is politics. I mean, in many cases, we don't see it that way, but language is politics. The moment we enter the realm of language, we have entered the realm of cultural politics, because there are languages that are marginalized or silenced. There are languages that are going extinct. And what happens when a language is extinct? And also, what happens when, due to certain historical forces and existential forces, people are made to switch their language from their original language to a borrowed language? One of the most fascinating debates around language, especially for African literature, has been the debate between Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Chinua Achebe, where one talks about using the indigenous languages, to write, because it's a language. That's one way. That's the clearest way in which you can decolonize language. In the context of colonized people, language becomes even far more of a political and their cultural experience, as we have with examples of First Nations people in Canada. The loss of language means the loss, in some cases, of identity. And where the other, argues that, well, it's unfortunate, but it's also fortunate because this language, is a new language. But it's no longer the kind of English that the Queen speaks. This English is now an African English. We are taking it over and we'll make it do what we want it to do to communicate our culture and to speak about our people. And then in so doing, it gives us the advantage of reaching people who otherwise can only read us in translation.
Mm.
These are two very powerful positions, and I can't say, in my opinion, one is better than the other because they both, speak very clearly. And like Peter had hinted, if you think more on the fate of minorities, in our own case, I come from from the broad Igbo group, but I also come from a minority group within the Igbo group. And so the Igbo language, like many African languages, have dialects, small languages that are spoken, in some cases dramatically different, that people from that broad, language group might not understand one another, when they speak in their local dialect. So they also need an approximation of what is called Igbo Nzugbe, the central Igbo. We have that in many other languages. I think a bit of it even in French, where I've heard people say that the French spoken in Africa is different from the French spoken in Montreal or in Paris. So there's that cultural part of it, also that experiential part. And this is so important for me as a writer. How do I, recognizing the limitations of my own education and immersion in my own cultural roots, that even if I chose to write in Igbo, what version of Igbo should I be writing and who exactly would I be addressing? So in writing, the writer faces the task of the audience for which you write. What audience are you writing for? Because this would also color the way you write. And in choosing to write, both for home in the sense of the original cultural background, but also to a global audience, is like finding the center, in between that. And we have negotiated the politics of language in this collection, Peter and I, by adopting certain practical steps, that will say, no, we do not want this. This language has its own ontology, it has its own integrity, and it should speak for itself. And if you want to know more about these words like Ikenga, then just go ahead the same way you check out for meaning of any other words in English or French or whatever language in the dictionary or online. Go check it out. And in so doing, we are able to communicate even more of the cultural experience that informs the writing and the experience itself of the author, of the poet. And I think Peter also has some ideas on that, and I would like to hear his thoughts.
Yeah, it definitely. I mean that ideological positioning of how do you access that knowledge, but I think a lot of I want to go back a little bit to what Nduka was saying about the languages that are disappearing. We have, for instance, now two remaining speakers left of Ngu, a San language in South Africa, and Katerina Eso is working very hard to try and teach this language to others. And I say this very much in a North American context where the disappearance of languages is a very, very real thing. And yet the dismissal of the knowledge that is born in this, as Eleanor Sisulu points out with relation to Katrina Eso, is that this woman is a professor. She is a fount of knowledge. She is a knowledge bearer. Yet we don't recognize that knowledge in any way, in any formal capacity, because it's indigenous knowledge. And so this knowledge is often conveyed both culturally and in its conceptualization, the words it uses as in indigenous languages. So the loss of that language has to be there. But Ngugi Wationgo, or not Ngugi, Chinua Achebe, which who we've already referred to, says it. I feel that English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, but it will have to be a new English, still in full communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit its new African surroundings. And that is, I think, the key here as well to Nduka's writing and to a lot of African writing. New English words happen and phrases get talked. I think of the best example I can find is the South African writer Sol Plaatje, author of Mahudi, the first novel by a Black South African. And he writes in his diary during the South African War of 1900, he says, at one point, the expedition was most successful, right up to the last stage of its realization, when the whole cart full of apples capsized. Now we immediately recognize the English phrase, upset the apple cart here. And that meaning is retained, but the entire grammar is changed because it follows the grammatical patterning of the Setswana. Kolwana e tseleng diapolen chwe. And forgive my slight mispronunciations here, but it is that same grammatical structure of the Setswana that is just literally transformed into English, and in that doing refreshes a trite English phrase. And this is happening on an absolutely almost line by line in Nduka's poetry as well, where words are introduced inside the foggy chambers of Wuru Wuru, where Wuru Wuru, in Who Can Blow the Smoke Away, is an idiophone for corruption. So we're bringing in new words, we're bringing in new semantic phrases and syntactical constructions into the languages, even though we are writing in English. That's an incredibly political act and a very conscious act to do that, because writers are not doing this. They're doing it inherently and innately, but at the same time, it's a very conscious political act to reshape English and to make it African.
Right.
Yes, and then in doing so, recognize, as I pointed out, about how much it is even for the millennials and Generation Z, many of whom are born so far away from their parental homelands and who now have to acquire, a different culture altogether. And then you see that without the consciousness of writers like me to begin to bring this more into their own space, using poetry and every other opportunity that we have, these languages become even more threatened. It's okay that it can evolve. And so I am not imagining that the words will remain the same way they were, say the Igbo words, because even these languages are in themselves assimilating new words from English. And so you find in our own context, for example, that people speak what is called Inglibo, no longer English. They speak Inglibo. They speak Igbo, interspiced with English words. And it's acceptable even at meetings, because they recognize that these are urban people in urban centers, and who have acquired this, quote unquote, foreign language, but who would domesticate it. It is part of the survival of languages, part of the reason that English has become such a huge success. Its willingness to absorb words from other cultures and from other languages to continue to enrich the English language. And I find this even more fascinating with some of the decisions taken by UNESCO. Say, for example, in its creation of the living treasures, the living human treasures, through its intangible oral heritage project, which aims at recognizing individuals who represent our connection to a threatened tradition. Because there's a saying that when an old man dies in Africa, an entire library goes with him.
Mm.
So when you realize this and you see an old woman embodying knowledge, embodying philosophy, again, that is also not trivialized, but in terms of the politics of culture, it's addressed certain kind of derogatory terms as ethno-philosophy. Whereas this is philosophy in its own sense, within its own tradition, that is different from Western philosophy. So it's not the way we say ethnic food that says, this is the food, by South Africans or by Nigerians, say jollof rice. It's beyond ethnicity. It is because there are new fusions, the Afropolitan, the African futurism. These are the kind of things that we have come to witness in the most destabilizing cultural expression in recent times, with Black Panther, where there's a vision that a certain kind of Africa that also exists, within a highly scientific space or experience. So I thought
Right.
just to bring this into our own discussion, because United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization estimates that 7,000 living languages spoken today will disappear if nothing is done to preserve them. There are various ways that we can preserve these languages. And in my own practice in poetry, I just try to make my very humble contribution to that.
Excellent. Okay. Well, so much to talk about, but in Nduka and Peter, that's all we have time for. Thank you very, very much for joining us on the program.
And thank you so much for this exciting time and exchange.
Absolutely. It is. It's been an absolute thrill speaking with you.
You just heard from Nduka Otonyo, an associate professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, and author of the recent collection of poetry called DisPlace, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Also joining us was Peter Midgley, the collection's editor and an independent scholar. This episode is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And as always, sponsorship and advertise for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.